I'm Erica Lorenz. I'm the president, and Elric Walker is here. He's one of our board members, and Carol was, and Penny is, and I think that's all the board members. In fact, what? Well, Mark's away. Mark has a dual relationship. He's our newest board member, and he's part of the Connecticut Jung Association on their board. So unfortunately, they have a lecture tonight, so he chose to go to them. So, but he can listen, he can watch us. Okay, so if you want to sign up for our email, there's an email list to sign up over there. And donations is the only way we make money. We aren't even a nonprofit. We're just a volunteer. So that's the only way we can bring in people from the outside. All the local analysts, we speak for free. But when we bring in other people, we have to pay. We want to pay them. So please give us as much as you can, and more if you can. So, okay, the bathroom, we don't take a bathroom break. There's one across the hall and one down the hall. And there's a workshop that I'm doing coming up, an expressive approach to dreams in Connecticut, the first Saturday of December. And if anybody's interested, I wonder where you find that. Oh, it'll be on our email. I think it was. I think it was just on our email, so it'll be there. So. And we're finishing up. We have 2 more things in our archetypal study group, which has been wonderful. We're doing the witch Sunday, and then we're going to do the trickster in a month. So that's been fun. And we get really good conversation going. Usually we have a salon after this. Mark is usually the guide to our salon. Does everybody know where the Mosaic Cafe is? On Masonic Street? Because that's where we meet. And I'm not sure if any of us will be there, but please go have a cup of tea and talk. Are you going, Carol? Not tonight?
If anybody needs directions at the end of this, come find me.
Oh, okay. Would you like to take over the salon for the evening?
I can't really take over the salon, but I can at least make sure we'll get there from here.
Okay. Your name?
Craig.
Craig. So talk to Craig. He can tell you where it is. So our next lecture is by Royce Froelich. He's from New York, and he's going to be talking about the generalized media disorder, Jung on technology and disindividuation. Great title. So that's one of his favorite subjects. And tonight we have Robert Klein. Behind you, Arrow there. Thank you. I'm having a moment. Robert Klein, he actually goes out to the House Pueblo and they remember Jung. I'm sure he'll tell us about that. And Jung was there in 1925, and they still talk about it. Amazing. And Robert has quite a background. He said he was baptized into Jung, baptized by bookstore. When he was 21, he read Man and His Symbols. He found it in a bookstore, and that started him on his Jungian search and research. And in grad school, he used typology to connect with his research on group dynamics and leadership. And then in Boston, he took a dream seminar with Robbie Bosnack, who's quite a dream analyst. And Robbie suggested he go in analysis. Imagine that. And he had many, many years of that. And then he got his EDD at Harvard. And then you moved to Springfield, right?
Yeah.
And he was with the Connecticut Jung Association, where he studied a lot of dream work. And he also went to the New York Foundation in New York City and did a lot of seminars there. And he teaches in Zurich. He goes to Zurich and he taught for 4 summers, and he's going to be teaching this summer too. So, and he teaches leadership at Western New England University. So let's welcome Robert Klein.
Okay. All right, thank you. Okay. I think you feel like one feels like a musician here.
A rock star.
Oh God. I love their music. I don't like their lifestyles. Very good. Thank you for coming. I appreciate everybody being here tonight. As Erica mentioned, the impetus for this presentation came from a trip that my wife and I made 2 years ago to New Mexico. She had friends in Las Cruces that we visited, but having, strong Jungian background and interest, I wanted to go to the Taos Pueblo, having read Jung's Memories, Dreams, Reflections, his autobiography. And we're going to look at that tonight, his writings and his visit there. And you never know what kinds of adventures these things lead to. I found it intriguing, and as they say in New Mexico, enchanting. I've been challenged a little bit by a cold, so I'm, just to say that, as I'm sipping water, just trying to keep equilibrium here. But no big problem. Christine Olson and I, who's, one of the people who's an organizer here and, works with the executive group, just thought about the format tonight. And what I'm going to do is I'd like to present material for about an hour and 15 minutes. I have a wide range of slides related to Taos Pueblo and some of the key characters in here. And then I thought, we could open up for discussion after that. I found there's a lot of very meaningful and intense material here we'll touch on that's highly relevant to our 21st century, to our own journeys. There's a lot of points of connection. So it was very rich material to work with, and I'm excited about our evening. Let me say, I took the liberty, with discretion, to adjust language a little bit to make it more inclusive. We're looking at things sometimes that are, dated, and I use, the Pueblo people instead of Indian. They prefer that, and also to be inclusive for everyone in the room. So I don't think I've adjusted anything that distorts meaning, but to try to bring people into meaning. So just to give that as a little warning on it, but it's, what I've decided to do because I like to do that. And if we have some time at the end, they had a powwow. Penny and I were talking about that in the summer. By putting together the materials for tonight, I discovered this, and what they had was they had Native American peoples from the Midwest and Southwest, and they get together and they have a dance-off and a drum-off, and they compete. And so I got onto this website, and they had some wonderful slides and images that are very colorful and reflect their culture, so I have that in my back pocket. So if we run out of discussion, but there are a couple of slides I do want to show you regardless. They're a couple of my favorites. So that's the trajectory of the evening there. So we'll proceed. I never am wired in like this. I present at school in large groups. I have had 150 engineers in an amphitheater, and I come from a loud family. It makes things pretty easy. A military family with 2 other brothers, so people talk directly from different rooms. So good. All right, we'll commence. I was pondering how I'd open this presentation, and I had a dream about how it would unfold, and of course that decided the matter. And I knew I was in the right company to mention that at the beginning, and that people here would appreciate it. What bonded Carl Jung and the Taos Pueblo people was a deep reverence for the spiritual. What is our relationship to God, the spirit within, the spirit around us, the spirit of creation, of the universe? For Jung, these issues had a deep family connection. Okay, good. Here's a portrait of Jung and his original family from approximately 1893 or 4. Carl Jung is to the right. His father, the Reverend Paul Jung, is to the left as I'm looking at here. Then his mother is seated, and he had a younger sister, Gertrude. As many of us know, his father was a Protestant minister in Basel, Switzerland, where Jung grew up. You know, in such a household, we'd expect lots of conversations about faith and religious matters. But all was not well in Jung's family. For Jung's father, the Reverend Paul Jung, faith was a matter of a belief in ideas, of correct theological principles. It wasn't a matter of a living faith, a real connection to the inner spirit, that spark of God within, which has such a dynamic energy and creativity, and the power to take us into a more profound level of insight, knowing, and growth. The situation came to a head when Jung was only 20 years old, having just completed his first year of college, when his father died prematurely at age 54. To Carl Jung, central to his father's collapse was a loss of faith, a collapse of meaning. His father was a scholarly man who'd written a dissertation on the Old Testament Song of Songs at a distinguished German university, Göttingen. And as a pastor, he had tried to live a life of devout faith. But in the end, Paul Jung's theological system failed him. It became a prison of rigid conceptions and stone-cold ideas. Just believe these ideas, do the right thing, and you will be saved, he'd been taught. But he felt increasingly empty. Despite all of his service to God, he felt abandoned by God, unable to connect with the divine presence. He came to feel a despair about his life that led to bitterness, depression, hypochondria, and then death. One of the most touching sections of Jung's autobiography, Memories, Dreams, and Reflections, is when he writes explicitly about his father's decline. One night he overhears his father praying. It was the prayer of a desperate man pleading to hold on to his faith. Carl Jung is shaken and feels outrage. How could his father, who'd given so much, feel so little consolation? He saw his father trapped in the church and a sterile theology. Jung tries to point this out to his father, but it only leads to angry disputes and bitter quarrels. The situation becomes more toxic. Jung only wishes that his father could find the courage to fight with God, to fight for his soul, for his life, and for his family. But Reverend Paul Jung only becomes more paralyzed in his despair and takes to bed, withers, and finally passes away. At 20 years of age, at the beginning of his college career, Carl Jung is now left with a younger sister and his widowed mother, a woman who had had emotional problems of her own. He had to step up to lead the household and try to navigate through the grief and the serious financial strain that would ensue. You know, the dream told me we can't overlook the impact this had on Jung. While he had wrestled with his notion of God from an early age, this experience brought home, front and center, how critical our relationship to God truly is, our connection to that divine spirit within and without. Importantly, it struck at issues about what gives our lives value, dignity, and purpose. These would be critical questions that Jung would investigate for the rest of his life, concerns that clearly informed the development of his analytical psychology. What is interesting and what brings us together tonight is that we see direct evidence about these interests later in Memories, Dreams, Reflections when Jung talks about his visit to the Taos Pueblo in 1925. Now, I wanted to locate us here. It's in the northeast section of New Mexico. I tend to think as a native New Englander, if we want to go to someplace really different from New England, Southwest is a good spot with its desert and very, very different landscape, very different culture, very different background. So it was very intriguing to go out there. When Jung visited Taos Pueblo, he stayed there for 2 days, but in particular conversed with a tribal elder named Mountain Lake about the tribe's religious beliefs and practices. To know how important these things are, in the beginning of his autobiography, Jung says that he only wrote about things that were most personally significant for him. The Taos turned out to be truly notable. For the next 36 years, it went back and forth in his mind. And in the last year of his life, he wrote a letter to a colleague, Miguel Serrano, in which he said, "We sorely need a truth or self-understanding similar to that which I found still living with the Taos Pueblo." What he experienced there had left an indelible mark on him. That Pueblo in Taos, New Mexico is a designated World Heritage Site and a National Historic Site. It's a very beautiful place. This is an image of the North House where Jung visited. Across the river that comes up from a beautiful lake, this is really the sacred, up in the sacred mountains there. It has a very interesting history of its own and a curious one. Teddy Roosevelt took it away from the tribe to make it, a national park. And the Taos Pueblo people battled with Washington for decades. And of all people, it was Richard Nixon who gave it back to them. And you and I just can't walk up there, believe me. But they have a beautiful lake up there that runs down through the village, and the water is immaculate, and they have, religious rites there with the river, but it's drinking water and everything. And on the other side here, you'll see the south, what they call the South House, which is similar. But this is the original one and the magnificent one, and where Jung visited. We'll talk about that. The Native Americans have inhabited the area for over 1,000 years, and it's a sacred place with a remarkable history. And it turns out to be, in my opinion, as remarkable as any in North America. A history that connects most meaningfully with Jung's experience there. As I mentioned, my wife and I visited the Taos Pueblo the last 2 years. While in New Mexico, the first time we went there specifically, as I mentioned, for the Jungian connection. However, as we explored the state and its rich Native American history, we found out other things that really deepened our whole understanding of what Jung talked about. That information will be integrated into our presentation as we move along. And I think certainly some of the conclusions we're going to draw couldn't be more relevant for the 21st century. So there's a great history and a great moment in time with Jung's visit and how significant it was for him. But it comes right forward to us in a very, very meaningful way, and I'm looking forward to where we move with this. Okay, let's start with Jung's account in Memories, Dreams, Reflections, when he says that he conversed with a tribal chief named Ochwebiano, which translates as Mountain Lake, which is the name I'm going to use here. Here's a portrait of Mountain Lake that was painted about 6 years after his visit in Jung's visit in 1925. And I preferred it to these old photographs. It's vivid and it's colorful and it has a nice richness to it. Mountain Lake also had a Spanish name, Antonio Mirabel, which was common for Native Americans in the southwest region. I've developed a relationship with a woman named Ilona Spruce, who's the Director of Information and Tourism at Taos Pueblo. She's Native American. She's about 36 years old and a graduate of New Mexico University in Indigenous People Studies, as we might expect. And I've been doing some work with Ilona. So she introduced me, this is a kind of just a sidebar, to the governor of Taos Pueblo, Richard Aspinwind, and he remembered very vividly and talked about Jung's visit and was quite conversant in it. But here's what's interesting, and here's the cross-cultural thing. He's referring to Mountain Lake. Now, I'm calling it Mountain Lake, with all due deference in loving that name, and it's sacred up to them. And he's calling him Antonio Mirabel, because he thinks I'm going to be more comfortable with that. So it was a really curious discussion, and quite animated and engaged, but I noticed this kind of peculiarity to it. You think you're trying to do the right thing, and so did it. So anyway, but, so there were multiple names here, but I like Mountain Lake because it gets to the rich culture right of that area. But the thing is that, Jung mistook him for a chief. Mountain Lake was not a chief. He was a distinguished elder. The reason the tribe had him speak to Jung was because he spoke the best English, which makes perfect sense. But, his statures reflected in the fact that President Franklin Delano Roosevelt later brought him to the White House to discuss Native American affairs. So we can definitely say he was an important representative for the Native American community. Now, according to Jung's account, Mountain Lake shared with him a frank perspective on European colonialism, which startled Jung and also opened his eyes. This is a remarkable passage. Mountain Lake is talking with Jung and says, "See how cruel the whites look? Their lips are thin, their noses sharp, their faces furrowed and distorted by folds. Their eyes have a staring expression. They are always seeking something. What are they seeking? The whites always want something. They're always uneasy and restless. We don't know what they want. We don't understand them. We think they are all mad." Jung looks and asks him, he said, "Why do you think all the whites are mad?" "They think with their heads," replied Mountain Lake. "Why, of course," said Jung. "What do you think with?" Jung is a thinking type, all right? So we think here, on the left side, indicating his heart. Jung states in Memories, Dreams, and Reflections that he fell into a long meditation on hearing those words. He said for the first time in his life, so it seemed to him, someone had drawn a picture of what might be the real white people. He now glimpses into the white shadow, what Western civilization has tended to repress and deny about itself in favor of more positive and idealized image. We know in Jungian psychology, with persona to shadow, what you want to show and what you don't want to show and what you wish to hide. Jung then reflects on the conquests of ancient Rome, the Crusades, and Charlemagne, and sees them in a fresh light. He said he saw past the sentimental, prettified color prints of European culture, which used terms like colonization, missions to the heathen, and spreading civilization. And now he saw something very different. Instead, he saw the face of a bird of prey, intently seeking a distant quarry. A face, he said, worthy of a race of pirates and highwaymen. It was a sobering vision. It must have jolted Jung at the time. But it's much to his credit that he was open to such a dialogue. As the Native American scholars say, in 1925, almost 100 years ago, there were not many European and American psychologists who were interested in interacting with Native people in this way. But Jung explicitly said in Memory Streams Reflections that he was seeking to obtain the other point of view so he could gain perspective, because he recognized that he was imprisoned in the cultural consciousness of European civilization. He pursued that critical outside eye to gain deeper understanding. And this motivation is something that Native American scholars have greatly respected in him. But his interaction with Mountain Lake would take a very serious religious turn in character. Why, Mountain Lake asked Jung, do the Americans not let us alone? Why do they forbid our dances? Why do they make difficulties when we want to take our young people from school in order to lead them to the kiva, the site of rituals, and instruct them in our religion? We do nothing to harm the Americans. The Americans want to stamp out our religion. At the epicenter of this cultural conflict is the matter of religious practice. In point of fact, for centuries, the practice of native religion at Taos Pueblo had occurred in a context of suppression, with efforts to eradicate it, first by the Spanish colonialists and later by the American government. As a result, the native people had learned to be very secretive about their religious beliefs and practices. Jung states that he never encountered a people who were so secretive in this regard. Jung is extremely interested in their religious faith, but as he tries to question Mountain Lake directly, he gets no reply. According to Jung's account, he and Mountain Lake sat on the top of the main building on the fifth story roof, which has a remarkable view, including the nearby sacred mountains. Here's a nice closer look at it, and we can see up on the top fifth floor is where Jung and Mountain Lake sat and talked.
Oh, damn.
Jung decides to draw Mountain Lake out by using an indirect approach. Ever the astute psychologist, he makes tentative statements and watches for emotional reactions. What things give the tribal leader an emotional rise? Reflecting the intensity of deeply held values, issues that are closer to the left side, closer to the religious mysteries. By this means, Jung obtains a small entry into some of their religious philosophy. As he states in Memories, Dreams, and Reflections, as I sat with Ochwebiano on the roof, the blazing sun rising higher and higher, he said, pointing to the sun, "Is not he who moves there our Father? How can anyone say differently? How can there be another God? Nothing can be without the sun." Jung states Mountain Lake's excitement, which was already perceptible, mounted still higher. He struggled for words and exclaimed at last, "How would a person do alone in the mountains? He cannot even build a fire without him. The sun is God. Everyone can see that." Mountain Lake boldly goes on to declare that, regarding the tribe's rituals, which includes worshiping the sun, what we do not only for ourselves, but for the Americans also. Yes, we do it for the whole world. Everyone benefits by it. Jung writes, I could observe from his excitement that he was alluding to some extremely important element of his religion. I therefore asked him, "You think then that what you do in your religion benefits the whole world?" Mountain Lake replied with great animation, "Of course, if we don't do it, what would become of the world? After all, we are a people who live on the roof of the world. We are the children of Father Sun, and with our daily religion, we help Father go across the sky. We do this not only for ourselves, but for the whole world. If we were to cease practicing our religion, in 10 years, the sun would no longer rise. It would be night forever." Jung says, "I then realized on what the dignity and tranquil composure of the individual native person was founded. It springs from being a child of the sun, a life that is cosmologically meaningful, for the child helps the Father and the preserver of all life in his daily rise and descent." Jung, of course, had strong archetypal ground here. People everywhere believe that through their religious beliefs and rituals, they have a special relationship with God and a special role to play in this world. The Jews, the Christians, and the Muslims all believe this in varying ways. And the Buddhists, for example, are the followers of the Enlightened One, helping to spread the Enlightenment throughout the world. There is a universality to this psychological standpoint. It is the way that religious practices provide meaning and a sense of purpose in life, the feeling of significance that is so psychologically critical for our well-being and our survival. But the problem then becomes that among various religions and cultures there is competitiveness, a desire to be superior, to be the purest, the truest, the ultimately correct system. This creates a lot of blindness and intolerance, and is the source of a great deal of murderous conflict in the world. Jung offers some interesting thoughts in this regard as he reflects on the European perspective on the Taos Pueblo people. He says, quote, "Out of sheer envy, we're obliged to smile at their naivete and to plumb ourselves on our cleverness, for otherwise we would discover how impoverished and down at the heels we really are. Knowledge does not enrich us. It removes us more and more from the mythic world in which we were once at home by right of birth. That a people feel capable of formulating valid replies to the overwhelming influence of God, and that they can render back something which is essential even to God, it becomes God and us. This equation, no doubt, underlies the enviable serenity of the Pueblo people, for such a people are, in the fullest sense of the word, in a proper place." You know, I think we can say that such people are psychologically grounded. They are in a respectful, sacred relationship with God and with creation, and they feel they have an important contribution to make. Indeed, their lives have meaning, a meaning that sustains them. Jung added a very important insight. Preservation of their secrets gives the Pueblo people pride and the power to resist the dominant whites. It gives them cohesion and unity. I feel sure that the Pueblos as an individual community will continue to exist as long as their mysteries are not desecrated. Jung's thoughts are prescient. The Taos Pueblo people have continued to protect their sacred mysteries and to practice their rituals to this very day. One can go and observe the ritual dances which they've been performing for thousands of years, right there in the ancient Pueblo where Jung sat on the top of the building next to the sacred mountains. As Jung noted, the preservation of their religion would sustain them, enabling them to maintain their community and their identity, providing them with unity and cohesion that has been impressive, particularly in the face of the forces that have assailed them. Now, as we got to know New Mexico and the history of these peoples in greater detail, what Jung didn't talk about and perhaps didn't know was a remarkable history that framed what he was saying. His insights resounded hundreds of years back into the past, as well as reverberating forward into the 21st century. You know, as my wife and I made a trek across the state from Las Cruces in the south up to Albuquerque, Santa Fe, and then on our way to Taos, we explored a series of wonderful Native American museums and cultural centers. What we came to learn from these visits provided the important deep background on Jung's experience. From that very Taos Pueblo, the Native Americans had organized a religious revolt in 1680 against the Spanish that was the only successful Native American uprising against the colonial power in the history of North America. The Pueblo people drove the Spanish out of New Mexico for 12 years. When the Spanish returned, it was under a very different arrangement. The Pueblo people were able to retain their original religious rituals. They are the only Native Americans who continuously practice their original religious rituals on their original land in North America. They have a very special place in North American history. Reflecting on this history for a bit illuminates some of the key points Jung touched on in Memories, Dreams, Reflections. One, the clash between the European colonial and Native American cultures, the intense secrecy that surrounds the Pueblo belief system, and the sustaining power of deeply held religious beliefs. We're also going to get a picture of what some of those rituals are today and their very relevant meaning for our own century. A brief outline of the Spanish occupation of the Southwest will set the stage for the dramatic events of that 1680 revolt. As the native people say, the invasion of the metal people. I love it. You know, you read these books. You know, in 1540, there was a full-scale expedition from Mexico into New Mexico by Francisco Coronado. I think we've heard his name in the history books. About 60 years later, in 1598, then there was a major colonizing expedition. And then about 10 years after that, in 1610, the founding of the colony's capital, Santa Fe, which is still the capital in New Mexico. In this sequence of events, the native Pueblo people were enslaved by the Spanish. They were forced to work without compensation in Spanish homes and in Spanish agricultural fields. In addition, for the crops the Native Americans grew for themselves, the Spanish taxed them, confiscated a portion to feed the military, the governmental workers, and the Franciscan friars, who were the religious arm of the operation. So the system was similar to ancient Rome. It's no wonder that thought crossed Jung's mind when he talked to Mountain Lake. He saw the conquering Roman legions, and indeed it was just like that. You know, it's very interesting when you study this. Initially in Spain there's a debate. Are the Native American people human beings with souls like the Europeans? It's decided they were. So the Spanish saw it as their duty to bring Christian salvation to these people who are devil worshippers. You can see projection and, you know, naming and judgment and the compartments people get placed in. There was a systematic attempt then to stamp out the native religion. And the Spanish see it as their sacred duty. What we see are the essential elements of religious conflict which continues to this day. This type of thinking, this type of psychology. And it's all over the world. This is a microcosm. The Native Americans pretended outward conformity to Christianity, but they continued to practice their traditional religion clandestinely. This was the origin of the secrecy that Jung found at the Pueblo. If they were exposed at that time for practicing the religion, it could result in torture, imprisonment, and even death. But they couldn't give up their religion because their religion gave them structure to their lives. It gave them purpose and a faith that they needed to survive all the challenges of their existence. It gave their lives meaning. Without it, there could have been spiritual and psychological collapse. Things came to a head in 1675 to 1677 when Governor Juan Trevino arrested 47 religious leaders in a sweep of all of the various pueblos. 4 leaders were hanged publicly in their pueblos to send a message. The others were brought to Santa Fe, flogged in the town square, and put into prison. This created such an uproar that other leaders from the various pueblos banded together, marched to Santa Fe, and said they were ready for war if the prisoners were not released. The governor relented, but the die had been cast. The native people, and this is part of the remarkable turn in beautiful, the native people now sought the right leader to guide them in a major revolt against the Spanish oppressors. They eventually turned to a man named Pope, one of the religious leaders who'd been flogged in Santa Fe. Here's a statue of Pope done by a Puebloan sculptor, Cliff Fragua. He uses a Spanish name here. More than anyone, it seemed, he recognized the deep tragedy that would befall his people if they were stripped of their traditional faith. He would lead the people in what the Native Americans call the great struggle between the faith of sunshine and that of darkness. The Native scholars called it the First American Revolution, predating the American Revolution of the American colonies by almost 100 years. Native scholars declare that Pope had a vision for unifying all of the scattered villages of the Pueblo people. There were 29 Pueblo villages all along the Rio Grande River that snaked its way down the middle of New Mexico and then becomes the border between Texas and Mexico. Like the ancient Greek city-states, each village was independent. While they shared certain religious practices, there were 4 different languages. Organizing the uprising was not an easy task. This moment would prove to be the only time, before or since, that the diverse Pueblo people would be unified and stand as one, which is remarkable. And here's a map that they use with the Texas public school system that shows all of the Pueblos back at that time. You know, the ones closer to the river have survived to this day. Some are now ruins. And so this is all, you know, in the small, you know, box there that identifies. The circles, you know, that are hollow in the middle are active Pueblos. And then the green squares to the right are just the ruins. The native scholars tell us that Pope was a man of exceptional leadership ability. This is part of my connection with how all this evolved in my interest. He was willing to listen, always willing to consider advice. When he made a decision, he would explain clearly the reasoning, the logic behind the decision. He demonstrated calmness under pressure and always remained reliable, patient, and displayed great thoughtfulness. He was respected by everyone. After 3 years of painstaking planning, the revolt began in the summer of 1680. The simultaneous uprising of so many villages overwhelmed the Spanish. You know, but Pope did not sanction wholesale slaughter. He simply wanted the Spanish to leave. People were given the option to leave peacefully. Of course, the Spanish military fought, and some of the Franciscan friars were willing to die for their faith. But ultimately, all of the colonists retreated for a defense in Santa Fe, the capital. The Native Americans encircled the city and cut off the water supply. In a semi-arid climate, having no water will bring people to the negotiating table before too long. The Spanish colonists were allowed to retreat in a long caravan that went through the New Mexico territory back down to Mexico. 1,000 Spanish were in the march. The Pueblo people were now able to reestablish their traditional way of life, centered around their daily religious practices and major festivals. Their cultural life flourished again. For 12 years, the Pueblos were able to keep the Spanish at bay. As noted previously, this was the only successful Native American uprising against a European power in the history of North America. But I want to show you something that's really interesting on this, to show the high regard with which the New Mexico people in general have come to hold Pope, and not just the Native people. We need only look at the National Statuary Hall in Washington, D.C. Each state is entitled to submit 2 statues representing 2 of the greatest leaders in the history of that state. For New Mexico, one of the 2 is a statue of Pope. It's a remarkable tribute to his leadership and place in history. And this is in the National Statuary Hall, which is a chamber of the U.S. Capitol. I'm interested in going to see. You know, when I look at Pope, I think of the contrast with Jung's father. How fervently Jung wanted his father to fight for his soul, his life, and his family, and not succumb to the downward spiral of events. And how hundreds of years earlier, this Native American religious leader, facing the extinction of his faith, and potentially that of his people, chose to fight, which produced a very different turn of events against all the others. It touches on the archetype of the hero, the energy within us that's willing to battle and not succumb to negative forces. I think it would have been truly inspirational for Carl Jung if his father had died. In the same way that Pope proved to be so inspirational for the Pueblo people. During the 12-year interim when the Spanish were kept out of the territory, Pope passed away. In 1692, the Spanish would return, but it would be a very different situation. There would be no more slavery. There would be no more taxation. The native people would be free to openly practice their rituals. We might ask, why did they allow the Spanish back? First of all, the visionary leader who had unified the villages and galvanized the people was gone. So there was less solidarity among the villages. But the Spanish also brought assets. Nomadic native tribes, like the Apaches and the Navajos, would often raid the Pueblo villages, stealing their corn and other crops and taking captives. The Spanish, with their guns, horses, and military know-how, helped to provide a sturdy defense. Nothing is black and white. Among the Native Americans, there were warring factions, and the Spanish could help stabilize the situation. In addition, the Spanish opened up additional trade opportunities with Mexico, which could help the tribe economically. With regard to the religious practices, there was an interesting evolution with this rapprochement. The The Spanish wanted the Pueblo people to continue with Christianity, and there were some Pueblo people, interestingly, who wanted to do that. An integrated plan of religious practice developed and continues to this day. There are services in the Catholic Church in Taos Pueblo village, and it is a beautiful church, also a National Historic Landmark. And then there are traditional Native American dance rituals held out in the Central Plaza. The two religious strands have intermingled. But among all of the Native people in North America, the Pueblo people led by Taos had that special place. And they have a deep pride in having held on to their sacred land and onto their culture despite all of the formidable challenges. This is something Jung picked up on without knowing how deep that pride ran. In our contemporary situation, each Pueblo in New Mexico has a number of special religious events when there will be public dances and traditional rituals. For every Pueblo, one of the most important days in the calendar year is the feast of their patron saint. This reflects that blended religious tradition. The Spanish designated a patron saint for each village, and the Pueblo people combined that celebration with a celebration of their own native religion. For Taos Pueblo, St. Jerome is the state, and the feast day is January 8th. Since this is the winter season, they perform the deer dance, a traditional ritual to bless the hunt and bring food to the village in a time of scarcity. But there's more to it than just procuring food. They also offer prayers that apologize to the guardian spirits of the animals for the necessary sacrifice. According to Native American legend, long ago, human beings and animals lived together and understood each other. They spoke the same language. The animals knew that some of them must be sacrificed so their human brothers and sisters might survive. There was a sense of kindred connection, and Native people respect the roles the animals have in the environment. They are related to them. If the sacred dance is performed properly, the people will be permitted to kill what they need to live. Now, my wife and I have twice attended the deer dance at a neighboring pueblo, San Ildefonso, which is nearby, because the feast day fell later in January, which is more aligned with our travel plans. But this is very similar to what takes place in Taos. Let me say, the first time, and also the second, but particularly the first, it's a remarkable experience to witness the dance. And I'd like to describe it for you. Then I'll explain a bit more the Native American philosophy and psychology and how it can speak to us in a most relevant way today. Here's a single dancer, and I'll describe the symbolism of the ritual costume or regalia. The black face paint shows the connection with earth and earth being. The spruce evergreen branches are a symbol of life and vitality, the way the Christmas tree is, for example, in the winter months. The eagle feathers are symbolic of the sun, or sky god. In the Native American belief system, eagles soar above the earth to take prayers of earth creatures to the great creator. They become messengers. The antler and deer hides reflect the acknowledged kinship with the animal. It's not just to be a decoy and lure the deer closer, but to recognize the relationship, the connection with them. Using canes, they can give the impression of moving on all fours. They also have small bells tied around the ankles, which will jingle with each step, making it more pronounced and more musical. The actual dance takes place in the central plaza. Two women, who are in the role of priestesses, lead the way. They wear white buckskin clothes, carrying spruce twigs, and likewise have eagle feathers in their hair. They are followed by a line of 50 to 60 men and boys dressed as the deer. Now, interestingly, off to one side there are 6 to 8 drummers who beat as one in a steady cadence. And it's like a heartbeat. You can feel it resonate in your chest. And with each beat and another step, that chorus of tiny bells singing come from their feet. They march as one for a certain distance and then pivot, cutting like a precision marching band, all moving in unison in another direction across the plaza. As they march, they break out in chants, like the cries of the hunters, and then moans and sorrowful calls of the deer, who know that they have to be sacrificed. The calls represent both sides of the experience, human and animal, in a dialogue, in a mutual recognition, in a dance of life and death. But from the human angle, it really respects the animal and recognizes what is being sacrificed. The dance is conducted for 30 to 45 minutes, usually twice during the festival day. Let me say, to stand by and watch this ritual is to be transported in time to a much earlier point in human history, to recognize something very sacred and primal about life itself, and certainly what is necessary to sustain human existence. What you feel is human appreciation for the other living things that are around us, that support our lives, with a recognition of the precious relationship that we have with our environment. Let's now reflect for a bit on the broader Native American philosophy and psychology reflected in this ritual. I'm going to turn to Native American scholar Vine Deloria, who is from the Sioux Nation, and who wrote a wonderful book entitled C.G. Jung and the Sioux Traditions. Deloria declares that Carl Jung is the one psychologist that Native Americans can really relate to, because Jung recognized the importance of the spiritual and religious in our psychological well-being. As Deloria states, there can be no real understanding of Native American culture without an appreciation for their religion. Jung was definitely on the correct path. Deloria talks about Jung's visit to Taos Pueblo. He then provides us with a valuable perspective on the Native American belief system. From the Native American perspective, the world is harmoniously interrelated. Physical reality is at the same time a spiritual reality. In their cosmology, human beings are not accorded special status. They're seen as equals to the other life forms in the Creator's design. Living in the natural world, the Native people saw that the animals were like that. There were strong and weak members in the different groups. The animals showed bravery in the face of danger. Mothers showed concern to protect the young. Animals had ways of gathering food and would seek shelter and build homes. And here's a lovely point he makes. And they had a love of play, especially the young animals, which Native American people appreciated very much. And I've been enlightened by, in studying this, it showed Native Americans that there should be a balance in life between the serious pursuits of survival and also moments of play which bring us joy. Native Americans observed that the animals had important knowledge and they could be important allies. it was valuable to build relations and make friends with them because they could be guides to sources of food and water, and they could offer warnings of impending danger, like the rustling or squawking of birds when a predator like a bear or a wolf was approaching. So Native American people treated animals with respect. They saw that they had an emotional life too, that they were sentient beings, and they could not be hunted without first gaining their permission. So Native Americans bestowed honors on the animals and sang songs to express human thanks. Delory illuminates some of the fundamental tenets that underlie the Native American belief system. We can see the close intimacy Native Americans feel with nature, a sense of connection that informs their beliefs, their lives, and the articles of their faith, things they continue to celebrate to this day. Deloria declares that this respect for nature and spiritual connection with it is a critical contribution Native Americans can make to Western civilization and indeed to other civilizations around the globe. C.G. Jung stated this idea himself in a lecture in the Vision seminars in the 1930s when he said to the audience, "The realization of native values by the American is an asset, not a liability." Jung appreciated the Pueblo and Native American people's highly developed sense of religious commitment and a connection to nature that transcended what he saw in the European and Western experience. To bring this directly to our contemporary 21st century situation, let's look at one of the last essays Jung wrote entitled Healing the Spirit, which he penned in the last year of his life, 1960, which can be found in Collected Works 18. No wonder the Western world feels uneasy. Nothing is holy any longer. Through scientific understanding, our world has become dehumanized. Our immediate communication with nature is gone forever, and the emotional energy it generated has sunk into the unconscious. Jung laments our separation from nature, which helps to ground us, connecting us to other living things and to life itself. He built his personal retreat, a house called Bollingen, out at the upper end of Lake Zurich so he could commune with nature and he could be intimately experiencing it. It revitalized him. It lifted his spirit. It inspired him. It kept him in touch with what it is to be fundamentally human. These were things he revealed. Sadly, and here's where we come home on all this, as we survey our contemporary situation, we're constantly reminded in the news of human beings' disrespect for nature. From the millions of tons of discarded plastic floating around the oceans, the current rape of the Amazon rainforest, and the increasing extinctions of other species around the globe. Here's an image of a wildfire that threatened Taos Pueblo itself in 2003. Fortunately, they were able to contain it. Currently, we know about the savage fires in California, which are becoming a yearly occurrence. And Australia is experiencing the same thing. Indeed, our sense of a connection with nature is badly frayed. What is clear is that we need to restore a sense of relationship, a belief that the planet matters, that other life forms matter, that we're part of a web of life that requires respect, caring, and compassion. You know, it takes humility not to put ourselves at the top of some imagined pyramid, considering ourselves to be lords over all we survey in the natural world, and then become brutal lords at that. To be in relationship means to be on equal footing, to see how similar you are, how interdependent you are, and how valuable other parties are. It requires respect and an honoring of the other. Beat is like a heartbeat for a reason. For in a real relationship, it is a matter of heart, appreciation, and deep regard. Standing there watching it, you feel like you are being reminded again of something that's very vital, beautiful, and sacred about life. Something that our contemporary world definitely needs to reconnect with and to honor if we're to survive as a species. One is reminded again of Jung's letter in the last year of his life. Having been in academics and done a lot of different research, you always have different people with different points of view. It's almost like Jung's typology. You find it, and his whole extroversion introversion originated from his work with Freud and Adler. From the first time they were introduced, he goes to visit Freud in Vienna, and Freud says, "Well, I have this Wednesday night psychology group of some physicians and interested practitioners," and he brings Jung along. And Alfred Adler presented a case study that night. This is the second time that Adler presented. And Otto Rank, who became a great author on creativity and other things himself, is taking notes. So they walk in there. What's the funny thing? I mean, the way people smoke back in with the old vaping thing. Jung lights up a pipe, Freud lights up a cigar, and Adler lights a cigarette. The smoke must, they're trying to clearly elucidate these issues. Smoke is undulating through the room, literally. So it's very interesting. But he saw, Jung, and he says in the development of his typology, that he saw early on the difference in point of view between Freud and Jung, and it perplexed him because they could take a case study. It was the same information, and Freud could pull out some things, that had, a social, family impact. Psychology and Adler could look at inferiority and the more internal aspect of things. And Jung first formulated extroversion, introversion, the first dichotomy in his typology, and then he went to seek what would be other dichotomies, and came up with sensing, intuition, thinking, feeling, and which became the source of the Myers-Briggs type indicator people I work with. And it's the most widely used instrument in the world for non-pathological evaluation and training and teaching. But Time magazine was talking about Jung as the last surviving member of the Big Three in 1955, and they mentioned his visit to Taos Playroom. I read the article, but I love that in Search of the Soul, and the core of what Jung was about, and it speaks to many of us, and it spoke to the Native Americans in a meaningful way. That opened up that dialogue. So anyway, I thought that was an interesting image to put up, and
great image.
Yeah. So it's a lot of fun. What resonates with people? Are there points or issues you would like to raise and we can consider? It always is what is important. I always find that what resonates within and strikes a chord is what's important. Yes.
What Jung said about how when he was talking to the native elder and how it dawned on him, this is what happened to my people when Charlemagne killed. That insight of it's the same thing. The colonialism hasn't stopped for 2,000 years.
Right.
And with that resonated with me, I had a chance to meet surviving pagan practitioners from Lithuania, who they never stopped either. And they've been hiding in the swamp in Lithuania doing their thing since forever. And seeing their dances, and hearing their songs, hearing a hymn to their thunder god that has been sung for thousands of years, with tears in my eyes.
Wow.
And I said to the one who spoke English, like, you showed me things that are for me only old stories. You showed me what they're like when they're breathing.
Yeah.
And I could see you having the exact same thing happen.
Yeah. And you're there, you're experiencing it, it's alive. And it's alive in you and with the people who are performing. And that's a beautiful thing. Thank you. That's a lovely story, and shows the universality. Exactly.
And I wanted to add with that, so many folk from a Western background, they kind of put through the noble savage thing with native traditions about this. They're the ones who had the intact spirituality and forgetting their ancestors did too.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Yes. Yes, we go back. Yes. And appreciate that. And honor it. It could do a lot for us in the
There's
21st
nothing
century.
intrinsically about natives that let them able to do that. We did too.
Yes.
It's a human thing,
Yes.
not a native thing.
Yes, you look at ancient Egypt and they worshiped the sun god Ra, and some of the, their theology was similar. And, we honor it in a kind of the Egyptians and the Greco-Roman tradition and things, and, and how all that evolved. But we've lost touch with it. And it's just what happened to Jung's father. The practice of the faith got so intellectualized, it lost its power. It lost its emotion, its inspiration, and no longer had a vitality, and he died because he'd given his life to it, and now it seemed meaningless. I mean, it's awful. But, that's exactly what we think about what happens to, indigenous or oppressed people or, people within Europe who are oppressed, as you're saying. It's a valid and meaningful point. That, if you take away their belief system, what makes meaning, you leave them desolate. You can destroy them psychologically. I mean, they don't have a will to go on. Once you lose that, as Jung's father, you're gone. So this is, exactly what Popé, as a religious leader, had a vision, and we'll connect on this, with some of the other slides, when we get to the end here. He had that vision to know what this would mean, that if they stamped out their tradition, the consequence.
I was going to say, when I was there last year in Taos at the Pueblo, I was with a young man who was talking about the church and whatnot, and he was saying it's been 900 years that it's been continually lived in, that land.
Mm-hmm.
The apartments are passed through families, and there's government housing. But I've been imagining what it must be like to be that grounded, to be that. How many of us have any idea of that kind of rootedness?
Yes.
And it is extraordinarily rare to be that grounded, and the land was kept. They were allowed to keep their land. And how ungrounded we are as a people.
Restless and wandering as Mountain Lake,
Yes.
observed.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Go ahead, Erica.
Penny and I just came back from Ireland, and when you were talking about the colonization, colonization, the British to the Irish, started about 200 years ago, and was brutal. It was brutal. At one point, when the Church of England broke from the Catholic Church, the Irish were forbidden upon death to practice Catholicism. And so they would go out in the woods. They would have a special spot, and they would make a cross of some branches so that they could immediately throw it away if they were threatened. And they had a cross that they made that had a very tiny. It was long, but it didn't have very wide, so they could stick it in their sleeve. So the ways that they had to hide Catholicism, it was horrific.
Yeah.
Their ancestors were probably hiding in those same woods where St. Patrick showed up.
Right, exactly. But you think with Catholicism.
Yeah. And how established it was, but that was, part of the religious wars.
Yeah. It was to try to break the Irish.
Yeah. Yeah, break their will.
And they stole their lands. They took off their lands.
700 years, not 200.
Well, but the 1860 was when
Right.
that particular thing happened.
But
yeah.
They were really oppressed for a long time.
Right.
Yeah.
And that probably gets at some of the clandestine things that the Native Americans were doing, to keep their faith alive. In a variation on the theme, but
Absolutely.
Yeah. Yes.
Are any of the young Pueblo Indians leaving there? Or they have any, difficulty like here? All the young people leave small towns and cities and go to New York and Boston.
Yeah, they do. I have talked, with some of the elders about that. Yeah, because, the modern world with all its attractions, and they have these phones, and we know all the seductions of technology, they're being seduced into it too. So it is always a battle to try to get them to appreciate it. And I think this is where the rituals, and we'll look at that with some of the final slides, to have the children participate at a young age and to have a meaningful role and to be participants is to have them, as you were saying, to experience that and have it be alive. Instead of, oh yeah, we've been here for this long, this is the sacred mountain, here's the sacred lake, here's the sacred stream. But to have them participate in the rituals is a very powerful connection, which is one of the pieces that help them to retain them. But it is always, of course, the family relations themselves. That lots, we all know that in a particular family, there are stresses. And, but the community is trying to do that, but it is a challenge for them. Because the 21st century technology and culture, with all its commercialism and, is attractive, it pulls people in.
Water, electricity.
Yeah, and basic utilities and things. I did have some slides. I regret that I didn't include them. I tried to look at a reasonable narrative line and then contour the images. I did have some of an interior of, the, rooms that they have, and it's very basic. It's natural wood and the stucco and then dirt floors on the bottom. It was a first floor. I was in Alona Spruce's father, and I had a photographer take a picture of it, but I again tried to, keep a focus here in a straight narrative line. But we went in to his shop. Across the river, they have shops, and we went into Ilona, who I've become friendly with, her father. And I bought it. It is now on my mantle. They have images of, in their tradition, the storyteller. And it's beautiful. And so we met, and so anyway, he tells me this story. All right? You're from Massachusetts. I once got to Provincetown, and it was the first time I saw the ocean. We saw that map, he's out in the desert out there in the southwest. And they arrived late at night, and it was dark, and he could hear the sound of the ocean for the first time. And it was very mysterious, of course. And then they see in the morning, well, they were kind of camped out, and the police came and, moving along, they're loitering and things. So anyway, it was kind of short-lived, but then they start traveling and going to a powwow in upstate New York, which is a conclave, and they bring, people from different tribes together. It's, a meeting and a sharing. And they're driving through Vermont, and they see this single farmer harvesting a corn crop out in a field. And they have compassion for him. And they stop and say, we could help you harvest this. And he says, what do you know about corn? And they said, we invented it. The reason you've got it, So they help him, and they said, gee, we thought this would be a 2 or 3 hour expedition. Well, it's a big field, and it ends up being an 8-hour operation. So then he invites them to dinner at his house with his wife. And his wife, these old New Englanders, is amazed. He never brings anyone home. This guy's such an introvert. And he's got them walking in there. So, of course, I think they had some corn on the cob in addition to what else they had. But he had them do there, in the living room, some of the native dancing. The social dancing. It wouldn't have been the ritual, but they have social dancing. And so they did that. So this is the story tells me, because you're from Massachusetts, here's my Massachusetts, New England story. So I've got the little doll.
Yeah, first of all, this presentation, I was on the edge of my seat the entire presentation. It was just so
Thank you.
interesting, and you presented it coherently that kept my interest. But my question was, I saw a show on public TV, Connecticut public TV, about Native peoples in the military, because it was Veterans Day, and how they had the highest participation of joining the armed forces in all the wars of the 20th century. And they interviewed combat veterans, Native peoples, and the Marine Corps. They had, they made a movie about it. They were the ghost. They had the secret code with the Marine Corps. And they interviewed one of the participants in that.
Yeah.
And the Japanese were breaking the American codes, and the Marine Corps, people were getting massacred because they couldn't keep the code secret. So they interviewed one of the person, I must be about 90, I don't know how old he was, and he said, I was in combat and the medicine man gave me some powder, and if you're close to death, you open it up and you put it under your tongue and that will save you. It was something, I think he was Apache, Comanche, or something. And then he said they were in combat and everybody's getting killed around them, their mortars going off, and he said, I'm about ready to die, so he did it, and people are getting killed next to him, but he was saved. And the Marine Corps guy next to him says, you got any little extra for me?
Really?
But my question
Magical.
is what they showed in I'm trying to make this brief, they showed in the film, I thought it was incredible, how combat veterans came back, and they interviewed women combat veterans who fought in Iraq, and how the Native, the community welcomed them, and they had to be purged before they came back. Like the dirtiness of murdering people, or having to be in that situation before they could return to the community. Then they had other rituals before they went to combat. So it wasn't just they were individuals going into combat. The community was with them. And one person had 3 feathers, and he was in the helicopter in Vietnam, and he had kept the 3 feathers, and he gave it to his grandson when his grandson was going to Afghanistan. So I think it's a community, it's not just the individual going to war. But my question is, did the Pueblo talk about rituals when they're going to war or coming back, or how they integrated with people coming back with PTSD that was helpful, or maybe?
Well, I hadn't talked to him about the post-traumatic stress syndrome aspect of it, but I do know, my studies, they had ritual cleansing before, a war, and then sometimes it was among the tribes, like we're saying, and the stream, we'd have to go all the way back in the slide pack, but we can see it, we had it right at the initial phase. That's where they do that stream, that pure mountain stream that they drink from. They do the ritual cleansing there.
When they came back from
Yes, before and after. And this was in, what I read from Native American scholars about their traditions.
Wow.
So it's right there, and that's part of the sacredness of it. Yes.
So in this slide, you call that the North
Yeah, this is called the North House.
House, and is it like an apartment house with
Yes.
it's only residential?
Rooms, yes, and and Penny, our colleague here, is familiar with some of that. But yeah, I had a couple of slides, and you're selective in how much time, everything. But I had a couple that were the interior shots, and I'm sorry I didn't just put them in the pack to have them in case we went in this direction. But yeah, they're like rooms, but they don't have, it's primitive. Because this goes back, 900 years, and so they're basically rooms, with some shelves and things, and they're very basic.
But is it apartments where a family would have a few bedrooms and a kitchen, or is it all like sleeping rooms and they have a shared kitchen area?
I've only been in Ilona's father's shop and seen pictures, but Penny, I think, has some answers.
The ovens were out in that area,
Yeah.
so things were cooked outside.
Okay.
But they're not really living in the apartments. They usually are not sleeping there now.
But they used to.
There's government housing around, but they might be there, or they might have a music shop, or they might have a little shop to sell things.
But it used to be living.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. But there's no running water or anything
They
in
would actually use the rooftops as their living rooms.
Yeah, yeah.
Mhm.
So like the tribe would share that house?
Pardon me?
Like a large family or extended family would all be living in that house and then?
Maybe, I mean, I suspect in the old days,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
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 Do
You-
they- do
There
they
were no doors on that first level.
Yeah,
That's
see,
all
there'd be raiding parties
up
from,
on-
from the Apaches or the Navajos, and so they were astute. And you'll notice that they had ladders. And what you did is you went up the ladders to get to the second story. You pulled the ladders up, and you know, they might be sacking, trying to sack your village here, but you were safe and you were up. In fact, I saw something in just surfing the other night with Rick Steve he's in northern Italy, and they had this and they had these towers, and there was remarkable narrative going on with this. And he says, "Oh yeah, you know, the wealthier people, they'd be up in the tower while the invading army is sacking the town. You know, they're up in these large towers looking out, you know, watching this, but safe. You know, so that, but they had a design to the system with a ladder system." And it's interesting. One of the funny things in Vine Deloria says this. You know, Jung was there, and he's up on the 5th story. They had the ladders at that time, and they were doing this. And when Jung went down the ladder, he did. You know, I used to roof. I had an uncle who was a roofer, and I was an apprentice when I was in high school. And I earned some money with him. But climbing down the ladder, I went face against the wall. The Native Americans just walk like they're going down the stairs, you know. So they'll just skip right down it. So they're watching Jung. And they go, bear totem. Bears do this. Bears will come that way. So Jung later looks up and sees in some ancient ancestors they had a bear in the coat of arms. So, you know, their intuition and their connection and you know, way of making sense has a beauty and sensibility to it, and part of Jung's visit.
Can you talk a little bit about his trip to Africa before and then his trip to India after, and sort of compare how he compared? I haven't read where he compared them or anything.
You know, no, you know, and even in Memories, Dreams, Reflections, it's compartmentalized. You know, he has the visit to Africa. He has a very interesting chapter on his trip to Africa. I've read there, you know, and I don't have just the authors right off. I've read the books. There's a book on Jung in Africa, and there's one on Jung in India, and I've read both of them, and they're very interesting. You know, when he went to Africa, it was for many months. It was part of an expedition with the British, and he interviewed many Native Americans about their dreams, and he was looking for Africans. Excuse me, I'm so locked into my presentation here. The Africans about their dreams, and was looking for cross-cultural analysis, and yeah, he had many. I mean, they were doing native dances there, and there was one night, in fact, where it was getting so wild they thought he, you know, could be risking his life.
No, he thought he might go native.
Might?
And he tried to stop the dance.
Commentators said he could have gotten killed.
Well,
you know,
that's not what he says in the...
well, what he says, yes, he prefers, but well, biographers like Peter Bear.
Both were true in my opinion.
Yeah.
No, really, from what I thought he said both. It implied that a friend, a colleague had been murdered in one of those.
Yeah.
That was in his memory.
Uh-huh.
And he was worried about becoming native.
It got just late into the night with the dancing, and who knows, you know, what things might have been imbibed or whatever else might be going on. But it got very frenzied, and so beginning to lose control. So yeah, Jung had a major expedition there, and was connected with the British colonial system there. He went to India because he received an honorary doctorate from the University of Calcutta. And he traveled around to many of the religious sites with Fowler McCormick, who was the son of a couple of patients, and the Edith Rockefeller was his mother. And so Fowler traveled with him. I think that that was more of a tourist kind of thing, and going to the sites. And he would meet with certain religious leaders, but then it was university oriented because he got an honorary doctorate and things. So part of the ceremony. I think the African expedition was more really penetrating into the culture. It's a remarkable essay. But he compartmentalized. He doesn't go cross-analysis on that.
Well, when he was in India, there was an interesting story where he was talking to an Indian teacher, a religious guru, and he said, "Well, who's your guru?" Jung says to the man, and the man says, "Oh, it's Lada." And he said, "But he's died. He's dead. He's been dead 200 years." And the man says, "Yeah, he's been dead 200 years." And that's when Jung says he realized that Philemon, that you can have an inner guru, and that's what he had, inner teacher.
Yeah.
Could you say that out loud, a little louder?
That Jung realized when this man said, the guru died 200 years ago, but he's my guru. He didn't even know him. And that's when Jung realized you have your inner guru. It was confirmed for him.
And Philemon was, of course, in the red book, his paintings. The lady back here and then to here.
What?
I'm sorry. Yeah.
It's hot.
Yeah, let's try to move along. I would like to show you at least a couple of the last slides. I want to tie people up. I'm sure you'll like what you were sitting on. Okay, go ahead.
Well, I think what Erica was just saying about Philemon leads into my question. I was wondering if, in the same way that the Taos people, the Pueblo people, had this religion which was gave them so much meaning, if Jung had what he would have named or described as his worldview, religious view that gave him grounding and meaning.
It was with the unconscious and his penetration into the deeper sources of this religious impulse. What Jung, and this was great because it was talked about in that article from the picture from Time, interestingly enough. And also Amelia Yaffe, who worked with him, has a great introduction to Memories, Dreams, Reflections, where she talks about, she said this is his religious testament. But it was that he saw that there was a natural religious function in the personality that was universal, that people around the world has expressions of it in the collective unconscious. But it was a recognition that, I think from a Christian point of view, it would be like the Holy Spirit, or that there's a voice of the Creator within you that expresses itself. Now, dreams traditionally in most cultures, it's part of the religious experience is dream interpretation. We see in the Old and New Testament, you see it in the Islamic tradition and others, and of course the Jewish tradition. But the thing is, so Jung tried to, as a psychologist, penetrate that interior world, and I think what he saw was that the outside expression of religion and what it did to his father, and how pivotal that was that you were not connected personally with, how God might be speaking to you and your individuation with that. And I think it has to go with your vocation and, your inspirations in the world and following that. So, but that there's a religious quality and a sacred quality to it, and I think we see it. I, want to give some other people who had a question, but I see it all the time because when I read, I make those connections when I read Scripture. So it's mentioned in different ways. And he talked fundamentally getting in touch with the interior to be able to be in touch with that. Yes? Yeah, and then I'm coming over to
I've
this.
been waiting so long.
Okay, then we'll give him first if you'd like.
Before we left Africa, one of the things I wanted to see if you could talk about for a few minutes is, in my reading, I was struck by the similarity where Jung talks about seeing that African man looking out over the savannah.
Mm-hmm.
And then Jung talks about his own feeling of being involved moment by moment in the creation
Yeah.
of
Yeah.
what was
Yeah.
going on.
Yeah.
And then these Native Americans,
Yes.
Mountain Lake, talk about their
Yeah.
very personal relation to the creation. And that seems to be a thread there. And I was wondering if you could talk.
Yeah, that's a really nice connection. You know, Jung said it brought him to something, and I think it's kind of, we touched on it in the presentation here, that when you do move back in time, and you go back to kind of a primal human experience. When he was there, he thought it was like in the beginning of creation, when human beings first looked on, you know, the natural world, exterior world, and had a conscious experience of it. Because it was all evolutionary. And this is part of what I like about the Native Americans, because they're saying there was a point in time when we were all interconnected. And in truth, you could go back in terms of evolution and identify that epoch. But Jung's saying that you brought conscious and you realize and you could understand. You begin to think about it. You know, I mean, fundamentally, it's about reflection and understanding, as Anita Yap says in the introduction. And so I think, you know, what's beautiful when you are, you know, observing like my wife and I did in New Mexico, the ritual, and you get pulled out of your reference here and now in time and space, and you're seeing something very fundamental, very human, instinctual in a way, but it's connected. It connects you to the world and to a sacredness. You know, their sacredness and belief ripples into you. You know, it's a way, you know, emotional intelligence. We're affected by other people's emotions, obviously. We're wired to be. But it's interesting when it's transcultural like that. Mm-hmm. And that's part of what it was. And I experienced a bit of that myself. So, I mean, that's at least some of the connections with it, as I might think.
Robert, you mentioned Bollingen, which was Jung's retreat to nature.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And he did things, he had no electricity in the place, so it might have been Taos Pueblo. You know? I mean, he liked what he saw, and he built off of it. You know, it's nice to use a little humor now and then, too.
I think he always had that natural connection.
Yes, he did.
About his dreams and, you know.
Yeah. It kept him grounded, you know, but here's the thing about balancing your personality and your, you know, and part of the typology that's always intrigued me is, you know, if I'm typing Jung, you know, he's an introvert. He could spend a lot of time alone. He was a great therapist, but he chose to spend time alone and really reflect and be in touch in his interior world, as we're touching on. And he recognized, here's a guy who's a theorist and a thinker, and he's out there in his ideas. You see it in his writing. He's moving around all these different ideas. So what does he do in some of his off time to ground him? He cuts stone. He cuts firewood. He does physical, hands-on things to bring balance, and as he says, wholeness to his life. When you learn to do that, you experience life and appreciate the richness of it in a variety of ways.
And he helped in the harvest with the farmers around
Bollingen. He loved to talk with the farmers and the people there, you know, who hadn't read his books, as he says. You know, uncontaminated, you know. But he could talk to them in a personal, you know, basic way about their life experiences and appreciate it. Yes, this lady here.
Yeah, when you asked at the beginning of this session, you asked if something had struck us, especially, and right away I thought the story of being connected to the sun and helping the sun move across the sky. And I'm just, this whole evening, since then, I've been sitting with that story, trying to feel the truth of it for me, because, you know, in Western way of thinking, well, of course we're not helping. The sun's going to be there whether we're here or not. But where is the truth beyond that? I've been sitting with, and it's what we've just been talking about, this sense that we're part of creation, and that we're aligned with what's all around us. And I'm just playing with ideas. I'd be interested in in other people's thoughts too, but it's a kind of a sourcing in oneself of the Creator. You are like the Creator, bringing that sun across the sky, and I'm also wondering if in Christianity the feeling of "Thy will be done," you know, if there's a connection there, that there's just such acceptance of what is, and such at oneness with what is, that you take on the power of it, you own it, and your individual self receives in that.
Yes, I think it does. It gets transpersonal, and I like what you say very much, because I think that was part of the predicament that, you know, Christianity, that over time it got so structured, it got so ritualized, and people were repeating it without the personal experience of what you're talking about. And what I think that the people, you know, that I observed, Cal said it seemed to be that they were resonating and staying in touch with that. Go ahead.
I was going to say, being at the dances, I would stand with people observing, and there would be about 200 people in costume rotating around the village. Not Taos, but one of the other ones, the corn dance. And I was standing behind a pregnant Native American woman, who's moving to the sound of the drums. I see mothers holding the baby, you know, Native American mothers. In other words, they go through these rituals with their babies and children in utero. It is not different. It is, they're one with the whole thing. So I was thinking, this is a primary sensation function experience of the world, not about ideas, but about living it through the heartbeat and through the trance. The village goes into a trance, and they're 3-year-olds with these old men. I mean, it is so in the body. And when you trance together, you're in a collective, you know. But this is very different than thinking.
Absolutely.
And it's really natural.
Okay, that's great, and I would think for the child who's in the mother's womb, who is swaying with that when that young child is introduced to it, there's something familiar, something connecting, and that is how you build culture too. But I want to show you one slide from the powwow. That's my thing. This is the princess of the powwow, Miss Sacred Vision. So I saw that and I said, all right. Thank you very much for your time today.
Please take a flyer and please give us a donation and come back.